Without further ado, let's cast this off to Ryan LaBouve. So Ryan is an awesome Techlahoma member and leader for a very long time. He's been a conference speaker. He's volunteered at conferences. He's helped work with and lead user groups. I've known him for quite a long time, and just an awesome all-around person in the community who's been doing some really awesome things lately, both tech and non-tech related. So Ryan, the floor is yours. Tell us all about Remix.
Hello, I'm Ryan. After that introduction, hopefully I don't let you down too much. Calling in this morning from the Oklahoma Baptist Disaster Relief Team Center, where me and one of my coworkers met. We're volunteering this morning, so taking a break from running some chainsaws to give this talk on Remix. And let me share my screen. Science. Somebody say something in the chat if you can see things, or on my screen. I don't know. Somebody yell at me.
Yep.
Gabe. Okay, cool. This talk is called Run Remix Run. And so for those of you who are not familiar or distant from small children's books, this is the dog Spot from See Spot Run, which I have had one of my good friends weld onto various memes that I like. So the goal of this talk is to convince you that Remix is worth a try on your next React project. So quick high-level overview, Remix is very similar to Next in terms of how it interacts with React, which is a full stackish React framework for getting started with projects. We can talk about that a little bit more if that doesn't make sense. I think it'll make sense in a second. So diving in a little bit deeper to our game plan today, I want to go into what is Remix, specifically what might make it different from other React frameworks that you would be used to working with. Want to talk through the fundamentals of working with Remix. It offers some primitives that around data loading, routing, deploying, and a few other things that I think are either hard to dive into from if you're just seeing a Remix project in the wild. So knowing a few facts will help you digest what it's doing, but also just a good zoom into what makes it rock. Going to go through how to learn Remix, like idiomatic Remix, which is just to say how to use the Remix platform as it's intended. And then I'll walk you through a few of Remix code bases that are in various states that I've worked on, so we can actually see through some different code stuff. This is also a bit of a crutch for me because if I timed my talk poorly, we can walk through this as much as I want to. So again, I'm Ryan. I am one of the founders at Startup Dev, which is a full stack consultancy somewhere in between 0 to 1 Web 2 startups, and recently we've done a lot of things in the Web 3 space. And then I also run GoodStar, which is a commercial demolition company. Those are slightly different endeavors, but they're more related than you would think. So anyways, so what makes Remix different? So on its website, Remix touts that it embraces web standards, but not at the expense of modern UX. And so we see this rise up in how it handles forms, the client-server relationship, and a few other details. So here's my next. What does Remix mean? So digging into their philosophy, they would describe it summed up in four main points. So they would say that they embrace a server-client model, including a separation of source code from content/data. They work with, not against, the foundations of the web. And so you'll see them embracing different standards that in the past other frameworks or other web technologies might do a slight deviation of and kind of make their own solution. They really try to dig into just embracing the standards in the platform. They use JavaScript to augment the user experience by emulating browser behavior, and this will make more sense as we get going. And then they don't over abstract the underlying technologies. And so one of the things that blew my mind is how they use forms. Is how I remember using forms back when we were arguing about CSS versus tables. And so it looks like some real basic HTML, like real OG HTML stuff. But when you see how it ties together with how Remix works, it's pretty neat. So in practice, less philosophical points, things that I've found help frame when I'm working with Remix. One of the reasons, and so people who know me from the community, it took me forever to dive into using React at all. And so I had tried every other framework, but I just never felt like there's a good like batteries included stack. I felt like every React project I did was kind of having to create the universe around me and then work on the project. With Remix, the reason I started using it is I just was like, surely there's got to be a React framework. And so I blindly picked this one, just to be honest. And it's great. It provides a really good batteries included start for working on a Remix project. Another thing for those of you who are, you have the client rendered app and then you have server rendered apps. And then this is like pretty much a blend of the two, which is very similar to Next, if y'all are familiar with that. And so it's like maybe a next gen take on a web framework, which I think is interesting. And so I think it's going to be pretty forward looking when you start using the technology. You see how they're going to take advantage of some really cool like cloud worker functions to do some things natively and speed them up, which is nice. And then one thing in practice is on the downside is there's not as many resources about starting with Remix versus something that has like Create React App or Next. But in my experience, the docs are really good, the community's pretty good, and it's not that hard to just dive in. So I know there's got to be somebody out there who's saying, why not Next? And I don't care about, like, I'm sure that there's people who can make compelling arguments on either side. I just chose Remix. I've worked on Next projects as well. They're both fine. So if you prefer Next, I would say that's totally fine. That being said, there's some real like yak shavy articles about why you might choose Remix over Next, but it's just I'm not here to make that argument. But if you are one of those people and are interested on what some of the makers of this technology would say, you can check out this blog post by Ryan Florence, who's one of the authors of Remix. So let's start with one of the real, starting with the end in mind, and one of the things that instantly drew me to Remix is they have these things called stacks. And what that is, so you have the framework that you're working on, and then in practice on every project you work on, you're having to set up either AWS, Heroku, Vercel, Fly. You're having to deploy your databases. You're having to set up your full end-to-end testing, and you have all these decisions you have to make. And there's this nice abstraction that the Remix team developed called stacks. And so each one of these is different. We tend to use what they call the blue stack. We customize it a little bit, but it is when you start off, it has a login, it has Prisma, it has Tailwind, it has Cypress, it has everything set up. And this is kept up to date by the Remix folks. So it stays pretty up to date. And we've upgraded seamlessly so far. And so the things that we're getting with that is multi-region deploys, CI via GitHub Actions with your ESLint and everything set up out of the box, email, password, auth, a lot of things that we're probably not going to dive super deeply in today, but it's one of the most compelling things for me. So if you're on the edge of trying this, something that is worth considering, especially if you have an organization that does a lot of projects like we do, you can customize your own stack, and then instead of having to run the same runbook or try to like find an earlier commit to like, all right, how did we set up this auth 0 thing again and again and again? You can customize it and have like a pretty good starter point. Not as relevant for folks that would kind of repeatedly or work on the same product for a long time, but really neat for if you work on a lot of different projects. So let's talk about the fundamentals of Remix. This is not the fundamentals of React or fundamentals of the web, but specifically some things that will help you map the other technologies you would know to how Remix would operate. And so just some very high level stuff. They have a great CLI. Obviously, you can do more than create a new project, but this is kind of indicative of how their whole CLI operates. And so you would run this, and then you can opt into how much of the setup you want. So after you run this, the next screen is you can either choose a stack or ignore that for now. You can say like, I want TypeScript or not. You can set up ESLint or not, and it ends with a project that's in a pretty good boilerplate spot where you can start coding. The next thing that's a pretty big differentiator, we'll spend a little bit of time on this, is data loading. And I've zoomed in a little bit. Hopefully this is legible. So you can tell I'm a developer, not a professional presenter here, but we have these ideas of some functions that will run on your server and some functions that will run on your client. This is one of the idioms that is different. So everything that's running in this loader function is actually running on the server. And so you can actually import and use node functions here. And it's nice, in my mind. It's co-located with your UI, and you can also extract this into another layer, which they would call your API resources layer. But you can this is pretty indicative of how Remix abstracts whether you're on the client or server from you a little bit, and it ends up things like server rendering versus client rendering you just get for free if you use the idioms here. And so yeah, and this is just here you would usually make an asynchronous call instead of loading in JSON. But if you had a different API you're using, you could hit it here. Or if you're using Remix in a full stack capacity and using Postgres as an ORM, you could have your services over here, and then you could call like, post get all post here and return it in a JSON format. And then it's made available to you in this use data loader hook. And that this hook has a few logistical sugars around, is it loading or not? And they cover that pretty easily in the docs. But yeah, this is one of the first things that I saw that confused me. So that's why I'm giving a human readable explanation here. Another thing, if you're used to Next or technology like that, they have file system based routing, which I love. And so alternatively, on other projects, like if you're coming from a Rails background, you might be used to setting up a routes file where you're having to explicitly say what each route is. It's like map/post to this input point. Instead, inside, if this is your app folder, you have a routes folder in here. And so this sales folder would actually map to, or this sales.jsx or tsx would map to /sales. And then sales invoices, invoice ID with this $, that would interpolate the ID. So if you're doing /sales/invoices/1, that one would get passed into your loader function via params, which they don't have here, but it's available on the object that gets passed into this loader function type. So you do like params.id, and you could look that ID up in your loading layer.
Hey Ryan, we did have a quick comment. If you are able to go full screen, that might be helpful. If not, that's totally good. Just wanted to share that comment.
Okay. Sorry, internet. We're back now. Talking about routing. So anyways, it has file system based routing. The other thing that is a constant pain if you're in the server side / client side render app space is how to deal with metadata. And so there are a few things like all the things that you would have to figure out how to inject into the head of your index.html or your HTML page. And so if you're using any of the modern things, it's always a bit of a pain to deal with. And they have a few, that's part of Remix's platforms is to work with that. And so here you can see an example of me loading in a style sheet for Google Web Fonts. And this is a very light abstraction they have to help inject those natively into your page. So as your page is rendering, the browser's not having to figure out all this weird JavaScript stuff. It just gets this rendered in HTML, which your server does for you. And so it translates really nicely to things like if you're concerned with SEO or different type of how social media sites would understand, because their sites have to hit yours and get this data. And so if you're setting it all up after page load with JavaScript, there's not really a good guarantee that it'll pick up all this metadata you want it to. Whereas here we have nice tools to help that end in a good native HTML state when somebody's consuming our site. Okay, so forms. This is a point where I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm just going to scroll down their docs a little bit. And we're going to look at how this actually works. So they talk about this in their data rights category. And so again, here, this is all how we're getting data from the client to our server. And traditionally, HTML used forms to do this. And if you're doing lots of JavaScript, there's an example in here where we are having to do something like this, which a lot of you, if you're longtime JavaScripters, you're probably used to something like, okay, when this submit happens, we're going to stop the browser from what it's doing, and then we're going to do something else. And so you're fighting against the browser at this point, which, to be fair, this was introduced as a way to help provide better user experiences. And so there was a time where that submission really hurt how things worked on your site. The thing is, Remix just uses the form, and it has kind of a super form that it gives you that you can use. But if you just use a form, Remix kind of just makes it work. And you can use what looks like plain HTML, and it just like your loader function, you have an actions function, and you can handle things on the server there. And so what you get is what I feel like is way more legible markup. When you're reading it, it's not a bunch of JavaScript, it's just HTML. And let me find a good example of where this happens, because the next question you're going to ask is, okay, how do we do form validation? And it has some nice here we go. And so you can come in and do high UX customizations using React hooks and one of their helpers they give you. So the more you want to customize it, you can opt into this more and more control. But obviously, as you have more control, so like, oh, I don't want to use native form validation, I would rather take control of it. You can opt into it, which I think is a nice flow, because you can get moving really fast. And then as you need to dial up the UX in certain elements of where you're working, you have all the tools available to do this. You're not running and doing other libraries, which you can. And again, if you want to use all of your classic React Forms libraries, there's nothing that stops you from doing that. But just for, and here's an example of, as things are transitioning, you have different hooks that Remix gives you. Nothing's stopping you from using all the tools you're using, but I feel like there's more out of the box here that you can use, even down to animating without introducing all types of other libraries and abstractions. So again, talk's not deep diving on forms, but something that we can cover like that. Okay, so we've talked about a few of the what I feel like are the fundamentals of Remix. And if this is something that you're interested in learning more about or seeing more, put it in practice, but you can log in, you can create some stuff, you have your own account. And I'd say this takes a couple hours to go through in earnest. And from here, I feel like most of us could hop in and build apps. I mean, that's exactly what we did at startup. And then on the top of that, there is a awesome Remix GitHub link with a ton of larger example apps. And so KenzieDodds.com, Kenzie Dodd, who's pretty big in the React community, he's open sourced his whole website, and you can kind of see how he builds production level stuff because he's open sourced his main site here, which is pretty neat. From here, we can look through some of the code bases that I've worked on with Remix. I guess let's pause, and I'm curious, is there any questions about anything we've talked about so far before we dive into some examples?
We haven't gotten any questions yet. Actually, oh no, that was Nightbot. No, I haven't gotten any questions yet. Well, we can hang tight for a good, maybe 8 seconds or so, because there's always a delay on Twitch. But also, if anyone has questions too, we'll interrupt you where it makes sense, but we'll also sometimes hold those off till the very end too.
Okay, cool. Well, this is a flexible part. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, go ahead. Yeah, there's nothing popping up.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll give a brief overview of a few different projects we've used this on. And so this is it's a cybersecurity company that we've started and needed a one-page marketing site. And then there is a larger silly project that I'm working on where you can see some routing and some different things. And we're interacting with a Golang API here, and the Spotify backup where you can, oh, well, that's blocked right now, but that's fine. Log in and back up a Spotify playlist. And then most recently, here's a Web3 app that we've built using this where we can connect a wallet, and you can log in and see a bunch of information. I'm probably just going to go through maybe this project and we can walk through a few things. Okay, just showing you in practice. This is just a little for fun project for me. So everything starts in this root, root.tsx. And so inside of here, you'll see we have a few styles, not a whole lot, and then routes. And so here, where I was talking about the different route-based layouts, if we go back to the working app, we have /methodology. And so if we go to the /methodology feature, here's actually a nice, it has great MDX support, which is markdown in Remix. And so you can come and see, like if you're doing a blog, I have a lot of just markdown here that I'm using to power this this site, which is great for if you're working on content or static site-esque things. Let's see. And I was wanting to find one place where we're talking to the API so I can show you what that looks like. Then I should have just bookmarked that. Here you can see. Okay, that's just what I want to show you. And so they also have this idea of server files. And so similar to where I showed the loader, this whole file runs on the node side. You can see by the .server. And so you can do full on, like more isolated from your content backend type node things. And you really don't even need an API to build a pretty large project with Remix. And here, if we go to see how we use Gitbooks, we should be able to see that in the loader. And here, where I mentioned we can just call our communicating to server function and load it as JSON, and this would return back. And so if we look to the UI inside of books, this is what it's doing. Cool. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then go back to the question section. Happy to walk through any code examples, but I feel like that's a pretty good overview. Again, happy to dive into specific questions or concerns, and we can look through some code together for a few minutes.